Many of us who have become puppeteers took up puppetry as a hobby when we were very young. It's possibly because we weren't in the crowd that was playing football and cricket and so on. It's a gentler activity, I think, and certainly not mainstream. Some of us are not quite sure that that's what we're going to do, and I suppose I was one of those. Murray had no doubt he was going to be a marionettist, and that's what he ended up as, and a very good one too.
Ah, yes. Well, I first met him when my late husband Eric and I had the Animal Act, a dog act. We were performing at a returned servicemen's leagues club in Sydney. Rooty Hill, I think it was. Anyway, we were doing the chicken and prawn night, and Mr. Raine and his puppets were also on the bill. Oh, God, I'll never forget it. That night changed my life. Oh, yes, I know you want me to say something positive. But personally, I think he's a disgrace to himself and a disgrace to the entertainment industry. And another thing, he's too highly strung.
I grew up in Georgetown. And Georgetown is a suburb of Newcastle. Newcastle being 200 kilometres north of Sydney, famous for its beautiful beaches, but at that time, the BHP Steelworks. And the Steelworks provided a lot of work for Novocastrians. In fact, my dad worked as a foreman there. He also died there in 1971, which left my mother and my two older brothers. I went to Waratah Infant School. One day when I went to school, our teacher announced, today is a very special day because today we are going to have a puppet show, but not just any old puppet show, it's going to be a marionette show. Now, I had never seen marionettes live before. Well, I'd seen them on the television. I'd seen Mr. Squiggle and I'd seen the Thunderbirds, but I'd never seen a live marionette show before. And because I was one of the youngest and one of the smallest, I got to sit in the front row. And where I was sitting, I could look up. And what I could see, high above the puppets' heads, up through the strings and up through the curtains, were the puppeteers. And I sat there thinking, wow, what a fantastic job that would be. I didn't know that people did things like that as a job. The next day, I went to school and I told my teacher, I told all my mates, I now know what I want to do. I want to be a puppeteer. For my next birthday, my mum gave me the most beautiful present, Bimbo the Clown. And the moment I unwrapped him, I knew that he was something special and I knew that I had to look after him. Well, my family endured weeks and weeks and weeks of Bimbo performances every night, relentless. They continued up until we went to see another puppet show. This puppet show was by a local puppeteer called Marty McClelland. And Marty McClelland was a very famous Newcastle puppeteer. We saw her at a department store. Wynn's department store had a beautiful reception centre with a stage, and they would regularly put performances on during school holidays. Marty McClelland and her puppets were performing Jack and the Beanstalk. Once again, Mum and I were sitting front row, mesmerised, because Marty's puppets were beautiful. They were beautifully sculpted, the sets were lovely, the show was fantastic. And Marty happened to mention that she was also a puppet teacher. a puppet teacher that took young children in. She had special classes for young children like me. And they happened at a place called the Young People's Theatre in Newcastle.
Well, it was advertised as a children's activity during the school holidays. And I had done shows at Wynn's, which doesn't exist anymore in Newcastle. And I guess people from there saw the shows. And so we went up into the big Brunker Road Adamstown School and we began puppetry there. And I met up with Murray there, and his mother was really pleased that somebody was doing puppetry and she could ask questions about the interest that this little boy was showing in working toys and dolls that he had and making them come alive, and needed direction and needed encouragement.
Marty McClelland had an enormous influence on me. Well, all through my life, I suppose. If it hadn't been for Marty's influence in puppetry, I wouldn't be a puppeteer today.
I saw a despair at first that really got to my heart. It was a despair because he couldn't break through academically, so I took him up to Maitland to my brother to get him to examine his eyes, and he was found to have those eye problems with a form of dyslexia, and I think that my brother tested his eyes and helped him and got him glasses, and we overcame a physical problem which then allowed him to be free to get into what he really wanted to do. That was a freedom for Murray, and the despair started to go. But I just looked at the longing in this little boy's eyes and what he could do with his hands, and things became alive in his hands. So I just thought, wow, he's going to be all right, this kid.
In the very early 70s, when I was working and learning from Marty McClelland, her puppet shows mostly were glove puppets, working on the hands. So my puppet shows were also glove puppet shows. But then, in 1973, my mother took me to Garden City Shopping Centre, which was the biggest shopping centre in Newcastle. And what was advertised was a puppet show, but not just any puppet show. This was a cabaret marionette show. I had never seen a cabaret marionette show before. So Mum took me in, and when we arrived, the place was packed. And it was to see a puppeteer, a very famous puppeteer called Peter Oldham. Now, Peter did a puppet show, but this was like a puppet show I had never seen before. This was marionettes. But Peter didn't tell a story. There were no puppets talking to one another. And Peter worked all by himself, in full view of the audience.
I had no idea at the time the influence my cabaret show would have on Murray's career. I also find it interesting that I was one of the Tintuki puppeteers who presented the Puss in Boots show at Murray's infant school.
The audience loved it, from little kids right through to old people, nanas and pops. They loved it. And I sat there thinking, wow, if he can do a puppet show by himself and get this sort of reaction from an audience, well, so can I. And maybe by doing a marionette show, a variety show, means that I could do a puppet show by myself.
I performed my cabaret act in Newcastle on a regular basis, and Murray and his mum were always there to see the shows.
My mother certainly was not a stage mother, but she was a mother who was extremely supportive and dearly loved me and the puppets. So she did whatever she could to assist me.
Murray's mum, Flo, right throughout Murray's childhood, unconditionally encouraged him to pursue his dreams. After seeing a television performance I did with a string puppet on a trapeze, Murray's mum, on Murray's behalf, wrote to Norman Hetherington, creator of Mr. Squiggle and performer of Mr. Squiggle, to ask about the stringing of a trapeze marionette.
Norman must have seen some similarities between the way that Murray was a young boy, then a young man, interested in quite an unusual sort of profession, such as puppetry. And Dad also had that experience where he was interested in puppetry when no one around him was, but he was encouraged, like Murray was encouraged by his mother. Dad was also encouraged by his parents to follow the thing that really took his fancy.
The thing was, we never expected Norman to reply. We thought, well, he's a television star, he's too busy. But sure enough, a few weeks later, in the post arrived a letter from Norman Hetherington. Oh, I was beside myself with excitement. We opened it up, and there was this beautiful letter, very encouraging letter from Norman, but also a detailed description, beautiful drawing on how the trapeze worked.
So I found this lovely letter that Flo, Murray's mum, wrote to my father. Obviously there was a preceding letter about the stringing of the trapeze puppet, but it says, "Dear Mr. Hetherington, we were delighted to get your letter and so unexpected. I might say here that Murray has been a fan of yours for many years. And the sketch you sent for the stringing, etc., of the trapeze artist was just what he was after. In fact, he went straight ahead and started that evening, and it appears to be okay, although naturally it requires some practice."
Now, little did I know that so many years later, I would still be performing the trapeze artist. I suppose you would call it a fixation, not quite an obsession, but my mother loved Liberace and also Danny LaRue. And Danny LaRue was a female impersonator. This is the Civic Theatre Newcastle, the very theatre that Mum took me to see Danny LaRue. The show was full of feathers and sequins and fabulous costumes. On the way home, Mum says to me, "Why can't you do a show like he did?" Now, not meaning that she wanted me to be a female impersonator, but what she meant was the feathers and the sequins and the glitter. Well, I think I've lived up to it. My 12th birthday came around, and all my mates, they were getting cricket bats and footballs and sporting things. I didn't know what I was going to get for my birthday. I opened my present on my 12th birthday. There was not a cricket bat or a ball, but a blue feather boa. I opened it. I said, "What's this?" She said, "That's the feather boa we admired. I think you should add it on one of your puppets."
That woman has got a lot to answer for.
May I say that Murray isn't a worldly boy, and Marty told me that if he is to go off someplace, he has to be able to know what's what and fend for himself. This is naturally a bit frightening, as you can understand, and I want him to do what he wants himself. I have 2 older sons who are both in the Navy, and I dare say you can imagine their opinion of his choice of career. But I tell them that they were lucky enough to have their father to assist them, and I have to assist Murray in what he chooses to do.
The Young People's Theatre is an institution in Newcastle, and it should be recognised throughout Australia as a fine training ground for young performers.
YPT was set up specifically to give young people in the Newcastle area an opportunity to perform in a theatre with professional lighting and sound and the best technical and scenery that we could give them. It really is a training ground for young people who are interested in theatre, and not only in the acting side of things but also the technical side of things as well. So it's really theatre for young people, by young people and with young people. So I think that was the ethos behind it when Bill and Betty Ford set it up in the 50s. In the 70s there was a big need in Newcastle for children to have a creative outlet, particularly in craft and in theatre crafts as well. So Young People's Theatre saw the need to set up not only theatre classes but also classes in puppetry and in pottery and in weaving and in art as well. And we set it up in a cottage that we had at the side of our theatre, and so students attended these classes. One of the most popular was the puppet classes, where they were taught by Marty McClelland, who is a very well known and renowned puppeteer in the Newcastle area. As part of their work with the puppets, they also learnt how to make puppets and to make the marionettes, and that's one of the things that I know Murray is fantastic at, is being able to design and make his own puppets as well. If you wanted to put a label on it, he was a child who had dyslexia at the time, and so he was a very poor reader. And we found that to help him with his puppet work, Marty McClelland suggested that he start the acting classes here at Young People's Theatre as well. And so I think Murray reluctantly started that, but he very soon realised how much he enjoyed it and how much it did help him with his reading and writing and the things that he needed at school. And I think more importantly, what it did was gave him confidence. If he was in a chorus line, we would generally have to adjust that and make him sort of the comedy one. So when everybody was going to the right, he was going to the left. So, and when everyone had their right leg up, he'd have his left leg up, and we'd have to make it a little bit a part of his character because he could never keep in time with everybody else. Murray was here from when he was 8 years of age. That's our starting age. They need to be 8. Up till, well, 18 he finished classes as such, the formal classes, but he still came back when he was working and did some roles for us. At that time we were really taking people right up to about 23 years of age. I think we saw very early on in Murray someone who was going to go far in theatre. He lived it, he was passionate about it, and it was his life, and I had no doubts that Murray was going to be able to make a living out of his skills as a puppeteer in particular, but I think maybe he could have even done a little bit with his acting as well. But we are so proud of him. I love the fact that Murray always acknowledges Young People's Theatre in the role that it has played in his life.
Throughout 1974, I worked on my new puppets, and I was going to call my puppet show Murray's Marvellous Marionettes. Pretty good name, hey? Well, I more or less had the puppet show ready, but I didn't have a venue or I didn't have a proper place to do my puppet show. But then disaster happened in Australia. At Christmas 1974, Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin. Completely devastated Darwin. I'm watching it on the news and I thought, I know, I could stage a Darwin relief concert, and that would be the ideal time to have the premiere performance of Murray's marvellous Marionettes. My friend, who was about the same age, he was a magician, and we both decided, well, this is a perfect time. We hired a church hall in Wallsend, and we staged our Darwin relief concert. Now, I must admit, I've got to be quite honest with you, we managed to raise $25. This one was one of my favourites. His name was Oscar, and Oscar used to open the show. He used to play the piano. So he's got a paper mache head. His body is made out of cloth, like little pillows that are stuffed with stuffing. His feet were paper mache, and his little hands to play the piano, they were also cloth. Up the top here, the controls, very simple, and they were what made the puppet operate. I had a rock band. This is the drummer. Well, his drumsticks look like chicken drumsticks. The two guitarists. In my show, I had a lot of transformation puppets, or trick puppets, as they were called. This puppet here is the Grand Turk, and he used to float on a mystic flying carpet. Once he would get on and he would do a little dance, each part of his body could magically come off, and they would transform into a dancing girl. Even the Grand Turk's head would come off. Unfortunately, this is all that survives of the original Murray's marvellous Marionettes. I can't say school was ever fun. Certainly school, for a boy who's very odd, is not fun. And it was even worse through high school. But I had a sanctuary, and the sanctuary was young people's theatre every weekend. Now, I'd also, by my late teens, had bought my first car, a Corolla panel van, which was absolutely perfect for fitting all the puppet equipment in. In fact, the puppets bought my first vehicle. They bought my first vehicle 6 months before I was even old enough to get a driver's license. The Corolla panel van changed my life. It gave me independence. By the time I was 16, I'd had enough of school, so I left. Well, finding a full-time job in the entertainment industry in Newcastle at any time is quite difficult, but I managed to. Theatre restaurants. Theatre restaurants, or dinner theatre as it's sometimes called, was very big in Newcastle in the early 80s, so I managed to find a job at Fanny's Theatre Restaurant, and also another venue called Pickwick's Theatre Restaurant, which I worked as not only an actor, but also a producer.
You're about to witness the luscious pomme noisettes in nails, bells, and buckets of blood. Something familiar, something peculiar, something for everyone at comedy tonight. Something appealing, something appalling, something for everyone at comedy tonight. Nothing of kings, nothing of crowns. Bring on the lovers, liars, and clowns. Old situation, new complications. Nothing pretentious or polite. Tragedy tomorrow, comedy tonight.
At this time, our local television station called NBN decided to launch a new children's television show called Big Dog and Friends, which Big Dog, well, he wasn't a real dog, he was a costume character, a suit character.
Sabrina, I am usually quite...
Do you eat a lot?
No, not really. What made you think that?
Oh, Now the
nothing.
idea is to sort of get it on your hips, your hips when you can find them.
Yes.
And sort of.
Can you do this, Big Dots? You can.
It's
Have
not
a
exactly.
go.
You have a go.
I thought you said you were the champion at this.
No, well I usually am. I think we'd better forget this and get on with the segment.
All right,
eh?
then.
Kelly, what do you give?
I was good.
What do you give an empty palate?
What do you give an empty parrot?
An empty palate.
I don't know.
Polyfilla.
So, I managed to make a living for a few years out of the Big Dog and Friends theatre restaurant, and I also worked at Young People's Theatre as a cleaner. So, I managed to make a living. For the first couple of years when I moved to Sydney, I worked for theatre companies as an actor, and our performances were all school-based. So we moved from school to school throughout New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, performing for kids in schools, educational shows.
Stop, look, listen, think, walk, don't run. Stop, look, listen, think, walk, don't run. We've got it all together. Together, you and me.
My kitchen stool's got better legs than those.
I'm always delighted to see some of my younger friends here at the laboratory. And I do. When you reach my age, everyone seems like a younger friend.
I really loved performing in schools. The audiences, the kids, were great, and they really loved our shows. I decided that I would also like to do my puppets in the schools. So, after I had finished school touring as an actor, I went on and I developed shows, especially designed for schools that had like an educational feel to them. The Tintookies was a puppet company. In fact, they were Australia's biggest puppet company, and they specialised in marionettes or string puppets like I do. But this company was created in the 1950s by Peter Scriven. And Peter had a dream, and that dream was to create a puppet company that could perform grand children's musicals with puppets in big theatres throughout Australia and overseas, but also smaller companies that could travel around Australia and go to small country areas and perform in public halls and primary schools. Before the devastating earthquake, here stood the Hunter Theatre. And the Hunter Theatre is where Mum took me to see the Tintookies, the Magic Pudding. And that's how I came to discover the magic of the Tintookies. The Tintookies eventually became the Marionette Theatre of Australia.
In 1979, when Murray was only 16 years old, Flo, Murray's mum, set up a meeting with the Marionette Theatre of Australia.
I do remember when Murray came in to see me about getting work with the Marionette Theatre. I had actually seen Murray perform at a little puppet festival that was done at Knox School in Abbotsleigh during the vacation, and so knew that he was interested in marionettes and that he could work them quite well. And the theatre that we had was called the Marionette Theatre of Australia, but the sad thing was I had moved away from using marionettes. When I joined, I decided to use rod puppets, different kinds of puppets, because that was what was happening internationally. The large marionette shows had become very expensive to tour and also not so popular amongst puppeteers. My problem was that I was also moving away from recorded soundtracks, and so I was looking for puppeteers who were going to speak for their puppets, And Murray was quite young, his voice wasn't quite right for the kind of parts we would have used. So it was very sad because he was someone who was determined to be a puppeteer.
Well, the meeting was interesting. I had gone along there thinking that Richard Bradshaw was going to say, yes, come in. Come in. Of course there's a position for you. Yes, you can make a living quite easily as a puppeteer here in Australia. Well, I was shattered after I left the meeting because he spelt out the truth. In fact, he's told me how difficult it is to make a living out of the arts in Australia, let alone becoming a puppeteer. But I was determined to prove him wrong and my shadow wrong. My mother.
Can't remember what advice I gave him. I think probably was come back in a few years, which he did.
I worked for the Marionette Theatre of Australia. For a year, I toured a production of The Magic Pudding, and I played the lead role, Bunyip Bluegum, the koala bear.
The gravy's delicious. It is indeed a remarkable pudding. Mr. Bluegum, it's a magic pudding. Well, I realised that he was somewhat unusual, but magic. The more you eat, the more you get. Me and Sam have been eating away at him for years, and not a mark on him. Hop in and have another slice, matey. Delicious.
While I was working for the Marionette Theatre of Australia, I was approached by the Life Education Centre, and the Life Education Centre had a mascot, a giraffe, and his name was Harold. And they had thought that it would be a lovely idea if Harold could make weekly appearances on a show called Cartoon Connection, which was a morning children's show on Channel 7. So they asked whether or not I could be the puppeteer. So 2 mornings a week, for 2 years, Harold the Giraffe made an appearance. It was unscripted, unrehearsed, live television, and it was a lot of fun.
Do you know that flies and cockroaches, those sort of things, carry germs as well? Get on their little feet. So that's why we should always clean up after we cook in the kitchen, you know, we make a mess.
That's right, because the flies will just carry all that mess around.
And cover the garbage up, that's another good thing.
Okay, ready?
I'm rolling.
Ready, Murray?
Do it on 3. Count to 3, Colleen, and do it.
1, 2, 3.
During the 1980s, I also went to work with Peter Oldham and his performing puppets. Now, I had only ever seen Peter Oldham on the television or in a shopping centre. Peter's work was mostly in the club circuit. Now, I knew nothing about the club circuit, but as I quickly discovered, the club circuit in New South Wales was an industry all of its own, and an enormous entertainment industry.
What really happened was in the 40s and 50s, the Tivoli was the king of variety entertainment. There was a lot of performers who worked the Tivoli circuit, which was a circuit of theatres they had in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. There was also the Sawleys tent shows where they would put on a big variety show that would have possibly, you know, a band, a ballet, and maybe 6, 7 acts of diversity. So the Tivoli was the king, and that ran until the early 60s, which was also around the time when most Australian families got a television. And I think that had a big impact on the amount of tickets that were being sold to the Tivoli. So unfortunately, the Tivoli circuit closed down. Variety entertainers moved into the registered clubs. And of course in New South Wales that was where the majority of registered clubs were. And so for the better part of, I guess, 25, 30 years, clubs were the main place where variety performers like myself and like Murray worked. And it was in the 70s, Sydney or New South Wales I should say, was second only to Las Vegas as an entertainment venue or a place where variety entertainers could work. And the great thing about Murray's show is that not only is it unique, but it has the ability to entertain all demographics. You know, it's not just a kid show. I mean, people sometimes, I guess, when they hear, oh, it's puppets, think, oh, it's a kid show. It's not just a kid show. But it works for kids, and it works for the elderly, and it works for every age group, and it's funny. It's funny, you know. What he does is so unique, but because Murray is Murray, he has that amazing sense of humour and his twist on everything. I mean, just little things like, you know, when he does the Pavarotti thing and the head explodes at the end of it because it's singing the high note.
We're not surprised that Murray has done so well and gone on to win Mo Awards and get flown all over the world to work at something that I think is in his blood and will always be in his blood.
How I see Murray now is as a master puppeteer, somebody who's accepted by his peers as the top of the line, somebody who's been voted by his peers 3 times to win the Mo Award for the best visual act in Australia.
I quickly worked out that the more celebrities I put into my show and the more elaborate the costumes were, the better the show was received. Late 1990s, as the clubs were slowing down for me, I was doing a little bit more television work.
Tell me dreams can fly, yeah, when I look at you, I see bluer skies, yeah. Hey, you count to 3, won't you come along with me, right now, come on down, don't be shy, I'll show you around.
And I worked on the second series of Farscape, which was a science fiction show being filmed here in Sydney. They used a lot of puppets, and at that time, Henson's were mentioning that they could possibly be looking at producing a stage production of Peter Pan, and it would be called Pan. After 3 auditions, I was offered the role of a fribbit. Well, I had no idea what a fribbit was, but also the role of the crocodile. I was most excited. I was most excited until I saw the crocodile. This crocodile was the size of a little truck. It was very, very cramped, and thank goodness I didn't suffer from any sort of claustrophobia, because I wouldn't have been able to perform it. Being incarcerated in that monstrosity was certainly not the highlight of my career. However, there was one pleasure that I got each evening. As I opened the mouth, I could hear the terrified screams coming from the children in the audience, and it gave me some sort of macabre pleasure. Pan was a $12 million stage spectacular, and indeed it was a spectacular. In fact, It was so big that unfortunately many theatres in Australia were unable to take it. So after a number of months of performing this show, it was announced that we couldn't move. There was no other theatre at that stage suitable or big enough backstage to accommodate the show. It folded.
Norman, of course, was involved in the first night of Australian television, which was actually on Channel 9. And then he also was part of the first night of the ABC's broadcast with puppets Nicky and Noodle. But shortly, not too long after that, he introduced Mr Squiggle, and of course Nicky and Noodle disappeared, but Mr Squiggle stayed as, by the time he finished 40 years later, which it was the longest continuously running television show, certainly in Australia, if not farther afield. As Murray and Norman both got older, they seemed to develop a really lovely friendship. I guess, in a way, quite a paternal friendship on Dad's side. And Dad used to worry about Murray for a few reasons, because as Dad stopped working, Mr Squiggle finished on air and he stopped doing store shows and theatre shows. A lot of those venues for puppeteers were sort of drying up or going in a different direction, and he used to worry intensely about Murray and, you know, what was in the future and how was he going to continue to make a living. And of course Murray was, but Dad just worried about him. It was part of the sort of care and affection. And funnily enough, he also used to worry because they come from very different attitudes or styles in terms of how they make puppets. My father had a very thrifty approach, so cotton reels and ice cream containers and all sorts of things would end up being part of the way a puppet's made. And of course Murray uses such beautiful, probably quite expensive fabrics and feathers and all that sort of stuff, and my father would worry about how much those puppets were costing.
Not only was Norman one of Australia's finest puppeteers, but he was Australia's finest puppet designer. And Norman worked for many companies, including the Marionette Theatre of Australia, and lucky for me, once I moved to Sydney, Norman befriended me. And he more or less became a mentor, and he designed many of my puppets that are in my show today.
When Murray asked Norman to do the design for his Madonna puppet, I remember Dad being a little bit bemused because he really didn't know who Madonna was, so he really had to kind of acquaint himself with her style, with the conical bras and all the rest of it. So in a way, he really enjoyed doing it because it was for Murray, but it wasn't quite his thing because him and popular culture were not closely acquainted. One of the things I think about Norman's puppetry is that he was certainly you could see his cartooning background, his design, the design elements in it, but he was also a really good engineer, and he worked at problems so that things worked out well.
And Norman would always say to me, when I would come to him with a problem and say, "Oh, I don't know how this is going to work," he would always say, "Well, give it a go. You never know what you can do until you try." And it's true. For my club shows, my costumes were being made by a costume maker called Kim Royal. And Kim worked for the Marionette Theatre of Australia, and she made the most beautiful costumes. After a few years of making these costumes, Kim said to me that she was moving to America to work and that I needed to find a new costume maker, but she happened to mention that she knew a lady called Judy Burnett. And at that time, Judy was working and making costumes for the new production of Phantom of the Opera, which was coming to Australia. I contacted Judy, and she had never sewn puppets before, but she seemed to be quite interested in it, and she said that she was quite good at doing costumes with feathers and sequins. So I thought, well, she sounds perfect. And to this day, Judy still makes all of my stage costumes and, of course, all the puppet costumes.
Use georgettes, silks, lightweight satins, lawn, because if it's cotton it's very soft, and jerseys, like a t-shirt material, things along those lines. But Murray's requirements can be quite different. Each puppet has a different movement, so you have to be aware of the movement of the puppet, where the strings are and where the strings can be attached. And each puppet is different. So Murray's request may be like Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton's boobs must move, her legs must move. She must have the movement that Dolly Parton has. So that's why all the fringing and things like that, because Dolly Parton has a lot of fringing on her costumes. It's no good making a costume for a puppet if you dress the puppet in the wrong costume and people don't relate to it. They've got to be able to say, I saw that show and that costume was exactly what the person wore. Like when I did Liza Minnelli, we copied a Liza Minnelli outfit that she wore on stage so that it looked like Liza Minnelli. Because the puppet is so small, the fabrics have to be reasonably soft. If you have them too hard, then they become too structured and the puppet doesn't have the ability to move.
During the 1980s, my club work, my school work and my television work had greatly increased. And I was spending more and more time on the stage, but unfortunately less time in my workshop to create new puppets. My friends Steve Coop and Sue Wallace ran the Sydney Puppet Theatre. They did performances all around the schools and at the Puppet Cottage in Sydney. But they also were wonderful puppet makers. I approached them and said, would you be interested in maybe building some bodies for me? I would sculpt the head and make the head. Sue and Steve would create the bodies.
My life changed when Murray Raine came to see us. It's got to be about 15 years ago now, I guess. He had in his hand the most outrageous caricature of Madonna that anybody's ever seen. And he said, I want you to turn this into a puppet for me. I said, I don't think that's possible, Murray, it's too outrageous. But we worked on it for a while, and true to Norman's design, she turned out to be very buxom in all departments, and what a fabulous puppet. And that's continued on from that time onwards. Murray's continued to challenge me with his ideas about puppet building and puppet staging and tricks that marionettes might do. And we've managed to achieve some rather interesting tricks along the way, and mostly applied to the celebrities that he caricatures. The marionettes that we make together are very much along the line of traditional cabaret marionettes, although we have departed into a couple of flights of fantasy with electronics. Nothing too wild, but there's one act that we've done that I think could well be unique.
Looking at these puppets' hands, these were the first puppet hands that I ever learnt to carve. And since then, Murray's asked me to carve the hands on a number of puppets. And it's interesting, sometimes it's actually quicker to do it in wood than it is in any other method. And I've discovered that I like it. I love that Murray asked me to do it. I was really delighted when Murray introduced me to his 4 showgirls and asked me to direct him in it. And I can understand why, because as a performer, it's almost impossible to get the effect of what you're doing on stage. You need somebody out the front looking at what you're doing. So I had a go at all the showgirls first. I like to do that when I'm directing, to find out how difficult the puppets are to work or what's possible. Well, I can tell you something, that Murray can get 100% more out of any of those puppets than I could. And each one has to have a characteristic movement to it, and he achieved it beautifully. Now, I've heard that Murray can't dance, but it's really interesting. When he picks up a puppet, he has absolutely no trouble keeping in rhythm. In fact, I think Murray's one of the best performers I know who can really pick a moment in the music and make the puppet respond to it. And I must say, he moves pretty fluidly with his puppets as well. So from my point of view, Murray's an excellent dancer.
While I was working on Pan, one day I had lunch with an old colleague that worked in the clubs with me, and he happened to mention that he'd found new venues. And I said to him, well, what are these new venues?
Cruise ships exploded, and Australia suddenly became a very popular and money-making destination for cruise companies to want to house and to keep their ships and run them out of Australia.
My first Australian cruise contract was on the beautiful ship the Pacific Sun, and they had a magnificent showroom and fabulous facilities. And I thought, yes, this is what I should now design my shows for.
The luxury that we as performers have on cruise ships that perhaps didn't happen so much in clubs was that when you went to a club, usually the situation would be it was a one-off show for a start. So you'd arrive at the club 2 hours before the show. You'd have very minimal time to set up. You were always working with a different lighting and sound technician. Sometimes they weren't particularly well equipped to do their job. So, you know, that would have been, I mean, it's hard for those of us who are singers or comedians, but, you know, for somebody like Murray, who's so pedantic about the way his show is presented, which is one of the reasons why he's so good, but because he's so pedantic about the way his show is presented, and he has there's so much attention to the detail for the lights and the sound and the presentation and where, you know, his you know, stage is set and from what angle the audience can see this and that, and, you know, to make sure that the fluoros are right, or the colours, the lights are the right colours for that character and for that doll. You know, I mean, he's so pedantic about that. So I'm assuming that probably would have been a great difficulty for him in clubland. But on cruise ships, what is great is that, you know, we have these magnificent theatres that hold, you know, sometimes up to, you know, 1,500 people on some of the larger ships.
Film. See how my backstage crew are just warming up for the show?
The use of flash photography
Yeah.
and video recording is strictly prohibited.
Yeah, and a state of absolute excitement.
Due to international copyright law.
Well, I don't know whether or not you got a chance to meet him, but he's a gentleman. Now, I know he's lovely for all passages, but not only is he lovely for passages, but he's also as equally as lovely.
You must be upset. Get off! Get off! Get off! Go! Yes, go! No wonder she's caged. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Keep her on the floor, Sandra. Keep her on the floor. Hang on. Stop. No, look. She's like this. She's like a thunderbird, right? So you gotta keep her up. She'll get gravel rash on her ass. So come back here. Come back here, and start again, and slowly walk her across the stage. Remember, artistic, Sandra. Artistic. Yes. Oh my God, moonwalking. Oh, I don't know what medication she's on, but I think I'd love some.
He's a genius in what he does, and sadly, I guess because of the way the industry is now, there isn't. He's out there on his own. You know, there aren't. It's not like there's 20 other people in the world that you could name that do what Murray does. He's a one-off.
So, that's it. You've seen it. My journey. From the very first spark that was ignited by watching a puppet show as a kindergarten kid to what you see now. A performer who has the privilege of entertaining you. If it were not for the key people in my life who saw some type of potential and guided me along the way, I certainly would never have realised my dream. And as Norman used to say to me, well, you don't know what you can do until you try.
Is that it?
That's it. Oh, God, what a waste of time.